Hi, everyone. It's nice to see all of you. If you guys are out in the narthex, come on in. It's 7 o'clock, and we've got a lot of material to cover, so I want to start us off on time. My name is Stu, if you have not met me. I work here at UPC with the international students. I'm one of the outreach staff. And this series, What Ferguson Means for Us, has come out of the outreach department. So as you guys are coming in, sit next to one another because we're going to be engaging each other a little bit throughout this evening. This is the first night in a 4-week series on racial reconciliation. Here at UPC, we're very excited to be hosting this event. I know that the title of this event is called What Ferguson Means for Us. Well, let's be clear, we want to talk about Seattle. Over the last few months, we've seen some events happen in Ferguson that have kind of elevated a larger national conversation on race and racism and oppression. And we want to take that larger conversation and contextualize it for us here in Seattle. And so we want to be looking at some of the systemic issues of racism going on in our city, as well as some of the things that are happening in between us as we relate to one another. We want to be looking at questions like, what's going on in King County that's creating oppression for minorities in our city? And so God cares about racism, injustice. That's why we're doing this. We care about it as well. We also don't want to talk at you the whole time. I said we're going to be talking with each other. We've also invited some singer-songwriters, a gospel choir, some spoken word artists, and they will be coming and sharing some of their gifts with us as well. And before we go, at the front end, we want to acknowledge that this is a sensitive conversation. Race evokes strong emotions in everybody. And there will probably be things in this series that are going to be challenging for you. And there might be a temptation to kind of push back away from the table and shut off and disengage. We don't want you to do that. Please don't do that. As our pastor George would say, you can't change anything if you disengage from relationship. And so my challenge to you would be to kind of sit in this tension when it comes. Be humble, listen carefully, seek to understand first before commenting, and then afterwards, talk about it with your friends. There's lots of good restaurants. We're going to have cookies at the end. We'll provide some venues for you to kind of hash this out with your neighbors as we go through the series. Most importantly, give grace to yourself, as well as give grace to others. We are all on this journey, and we're at different places. We're on this journey together. And grace for yourself as well as for others is going to be important moving forward. So to start us off, I'm going to welcome my friend April up, and she's going to pray for us as we begin.
All right, let's pray. Thank you, God, for each person here tonight. I am filled with joy knowing that you will be at work among us in powerful ways. Come, O Lord, and build up your church. Race is a sensitive issue, and I know, God, that it's not going to be easy to tackle. And as we walk together through this 4-week series, we are going to be uncomfortable at times. Have mercy on us. We may see things about ourselves that we know need to change. Grant us a heart of humility to be taught by you. I want to see your church united across racial and ethnic lines. In our interactions with each other tonight, may we be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Whatever our race or ethnicity, make us one in Christ Jesus. May your love cover over a multitude of sins. Tonight we remember our brothers and sisters in Ferguson and pray for your work of redemption there. May the name of Jesus Christ be glorified in that place. Speak, O Lord. Open our ears to hear your voice, even if you speak with words of correction. Open our eyes to see injustice and show us how we are to respond to it. You are the God of justice, and you will not falter or be discouraged until you establish justice on earth. You are Almighty God, and I praise your name. I surrender this night into your hands. Blessed be your name, O Lord. Amen. Tonight, we have the gift of having Veronica Moss with us, and she's going to share a couple of songs. And I just want to invite her up and thank her for being here tonight.
Good evening. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this significant event. It's lovely to see all of your faces here, each and every one of you. The songs I picked for this evening, I feel, is a great starting point for us this evening in the midst of the challenging conversations that we're going to have. I feel my mission, my ministry, is to first put Jesus at the center of it and make him first and say, Lord, in the midst of all of the difficulties and the challenges, we need to look to you first. We need to ask you for wisdom and guidance. So the first song is called I Look to You. So I'm inviting each and every one of us, before we begin, to do that, to look to the Lord for any questions and issues that you may have. As I lay me down, heaven hear me now. I'm lost without a cause, after giving it my all. Winter storms have come and darkened my sun. After all that I've been through, who on earth can I turn to? I look to you. I look to you. After all my strength is gone, in you I can be strong. I look to you. To you. And when melodies are gone, in you I hear a song. I look to you. About to lose my breath, there's no more fighting left, sinking to rise no more, searching for that open door. And every road that I've taken led to my regret, and I don't know if I'm gonna make it. Nothing to do but lift my head. I look to you, Lord. I look to you, yeah. gone. In you I can be strong. I look to you. I look to you. Yeah, yeah. And when melodies are gone, in you I hear a song. I look to you. Levees are broken. My walls have tumbling down on me. The rain is falling. Defeat is calm. Set me free. Send me far away from the battle. Lord, I need you to shine on me. I look to you. Lord, I look to you. Yes, I do. And when all my strength is gone, in you I can be strong. I look to you. Lord, I look to you. Yes, I do. And when melodies are gone, in you I hear a song. I look to you, to you, to you, to you, to you. I look to you. And now this next song I felt was really appropriate as well, because now that we've made the choice to look to him, now we say, Lord, what will you have me to do? What will you have me to say? What is the next move? What do you see needs to be done here? So with that, I am available to you. Gave me my hands to reach out to man, to show them your love and your perfect plans. You gave me my ears. I can hear your voice so clear. I can hear the cries of sinners, but can I wipe away their tears? You gave me my voice to speak your word, to sing all your praises to those who never heard. But with my eyes I see a need for more availability. I see hearts that have been broken, so many people to be free, to be free, to be free. Lord, I'm available to you. My will I give to you. I'll do what you say do. Use me, Lord, to show someone the way and enable me to say my storage is empty and I am available. giving back to you all the tools you gave to me. My hands, my ears, my voice, my eyes, so you can use them as you please. I have emptied out my cup so that you could fill it up. Now I'm free and I just want to be more available to you. Lord, I'm available to you. My will I give to you. I'll do what you say do. Use me, Lord, to show someone the way and enable me to say, my storage, it's empty, and I am available to you, to you, to you. Use me, Lord. Use me, Lord. Use me, Lord. Use me. Use me, Lord. Use me, Lord. Use me, Lord. Oh, use me. Use me, Lord, to show someone the way and enable me to say, my storage is empty and I am available to you. Yeah. Oh, my storage is empty and I am available to you. To you, my storage is empty, and I am available to you. To God bless you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for setting the tone for tonight. So now I'm going to introduce our main speaker, Dr. David Leong. Some of you may recall he came here in January as part of the Wrestling with Reconciliation series. And he's graciously offered to come and take us deeper into housing segregation and so much more. As you may know, David is a professor at Seattle Pacific University in Missiology, and he is a member of Rainier Avenue Church in the Hillman City neighborhood in South Seattle. So let's welcome David up to teach us tonight.
All right, I think I'm on here. Well, thanks again for having me out. It's really a privilege to be here and to kick off the series. There's so much that could be said, and yet there's so little time. I'm mindful of the clock. I tend to, I think I have a bad habit of over-preparing or perhaps putting too much material into time that we can cover. And so what happens is we end up going really quickly. I will kind of try to pace myself and watch the clock, but I'll also be gauging your expressions to see if we're moving too quickly or too slowly or if we're comprehending or whatnot. But that said, I have a bunch of slides. Before we talk about some of the content, I have a little bit of the big ideas laid out for you. And I assume this will come up in just a second. But I thought I'd share just a little bit of my personal background and my story, maybe why this broader conversation matters to me. I'm a third-generation Chinese American, which means that my grandparents immigrated from southern China. They settled in Detroit, Michigan of all places. There actually is a pretty sizable Chinese immigrant population in the city of Detroit during that time. And my parents grew up in a Chinese laundry, so on both sides, both sets of my grandparents ran Chinese laundries in the city, and my parents grew up literally in the laundry, behind or above in little kind of makeshift apartments there. My grandparents sacrificed a lot so that my parents could go to college, and it's a very typical Chinese immigrant story in some ways. But we moved from Detroit to North Carolina, and that's where I spent a lot of my childhood. And I really was not aware, I joke with people that I really wasn't aware that I was Chinese until I moved to the West Coast. Partly for a number of different reasons. I think part of just naive isolation. There's a few memories that stick out from North Carolina from my childhood. One, I do remember this one time that my family, we went to the state fair, which was a big deal. This was in Raleigh, North Carolina. And we went to the state fair, and there was a lot of, the usual state fair festivities, rides and games and food and whatnot. And I remember as we were coming into the area, there were some people, a small group of people. Maybe it was some young adults or a family. I wasn't sure, but they were yelling something at that I figured out. I guess they were yelling at us. They were yelling at my family. We were all together, me, my two sisters, and my parents. And I think as a kid, I didn't really understand what was going on. And they were saying something to the effect of, go back to where you came from. And I was a little confused because I think I turned to my parents later. They kind of moved us quickly away from the situation. But I later asked them, like, oh, what were they saying? And they were telling us, to go back to where we came from. And I said, do they want us to go back to Michigan? I was really confused as a kid. And I thought, like, and my parents, I think, just kind of changed the topic or something, but I really wasn't aware, aside from a few random incidents. I mean, these are few and far between. For the most part, I really enjoyed life there. I did recognize that there weren't a lot of other Asian people in our neighborhood, in our school. In my school, I was bused like 90 minutes into the city in Raleigh to go to elementary school. And I remember there was a Korean kid on the bus named Eugene, and then there was my sister. And that was it, kind of in our elementary school. So there weren't other Asians with whom I could identify. And so it wasn't really until I moved to the West Coast that we spent a little time in Oakland in the Bay Area. And it was a very different, very different kind of scene. And for the first time, I saw like large populations of Asians and Asian Americans and Asian immigrants. And it was a kind of eye-opening experience for me. It probably wasn't until college that I began to go through what some psychologists or social psychologists would call my racial identity formation. I went to the University of Washington, so go Huskies, and I was immersed in an Asian American Christian environment. And what happened is I slowly began to realize that my Asianness, my Chinese Americanness, my Asian Americanness actually mattered a lot for who I was and for what I was doing. Fast forward quite a few years, I went to seminary. I came back from seminary, and I was working as a pastor at Quest Church. Some of you may have heard of it. It's not too far from here. And this is about 11 years ago, and my time at Quest was really formative. This was the first time as a Christian that we had talked about issues of race in the church. And what was happening at Quest was we were hosting a series of conversations and kind of class sessions, not unlike this, but in a different venue. And we just called it Faith and Race. And it was the first time that as a Christian, I had been invited to bring kind of my full ethnic identity, my racial identity to the table in interaction with Christian theology and the Christian story and kind of questions about the community of the church and so forth. And it was a really, I have to say, those times at Quest, the years that I was there for about 4 years, and each year we would host these conversations. Those conversations on faith and race were some of the most formative and powerful and yet difficult and painful and tense conversations I'd had in the church in my whole life, and I grew up in the church. And so I think that's just maybe a reminder to me that these conversations are really important, and they are so hard. They're so hard to do, and especially in a venue like this, a one-to-many venue. A lot of the work that needs to be done happens around a smaller table, in a more intimate setting, in people's homes, where people can be honest, where there's space to process, where we can kind of be authentic with one another and so forth. And so recognizing all of that, I know that this is kind of a difficult, somewhat artificial setting in which to kick things off, and yet I'm going to dump all of this information on you, and I'm going to hope that throughout, we're going to pause at a couple of points, but I hope that we'll have some conversation along the way so that maybe in a very small way we'll be able to interact with our neighbors and dig in a little bit to the material. So that said, I want to jump right in and talk about some of the bigger ideas that we'll have. So if I can get to the first slide. We're going to be dividing this into two parts, and I'm hoping it'll kind of be half and half. We'll see how the time goes. The first part of the evening, I'm just calling the big ideas. And I thought just because before we talk about very specific things along, Seattle's history of housing segregation or particular issues in Ferguson, I thought we would just start kind of at ground zero and say, like, what is this idea of race or not seeing race? What is colorblindness? Why would we even talk about that kind of idea? And perhaps what's wrong with this idea of colorblindness. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll try to provide a very concise definition of structural racism. And so both of these, I think, are kind of ground rules, or not so much ground rules, but maybe a place to begin. And I think I'm hoping that this will lay a little groundwork for the rest of the evening, but also future weeks' conversations as well. And I hope that in this first section, there will be some foundational ideas, some scaffolding, if you will, at which we can hang the rest of the stuff. After that, we'll kind of transition a bit, and then we'll move into talking about Ferguson and Seattle. We'll talk about housing segregation, some residential issues, and so forth. And where we'll end up, I hope, is talking about the ministry of reconciliation and how central that is to Christian identity. So, all right, so here we go. I want to begin, this feels very professorial of me, but I want to begin with a book recommendation. And I've got just one slide with a few brief excerpts on it from a book called Divided by Faith. So if I could get that next slide. How many of you have read Divided by Faith or heard of it? Anybody? A number of you? Okay, that's good. That's good. If you're not familiar with the book, it's definitely a must-read. I recommend you picking it up. It's actually, as far as Christian books go, it's relatively old. It's 15 years old. But it's a really important study. The fact is that people are still using the book because it's a really unique perspective on faith and race, and in particular, the ways that people describe their ability to see race as a problem, or the ways that they mask that, or the kind of ways that we tend to avoid conversations of race, especially in evangelical circles. In a nutshell, the book is written by two sociologists. Actually, I know one of them for sure is a Christian, the other I'm not sure. Michael Emerson, Christian Smith. And the book is really full of a lot of interviews and transcripts and descriptions of them traveling across the country, interviewing primarily white evangelicals and asking them, do we have a race problem in America? And then them looking at the data and narrating some of the things that they saw out of the data. I will have to warn you, the book is it's a good read. It's an important book. It is not an easy read, partially because a lot of the conclusions they draw are, shall we say, less than encouraging about the relationship between the Christian faith and racial issues. This brief quote from the beginning basically lays out the premise of the book. It says, "We argue that religion, as structured in America, is unable to make a great impact on the racialized society. In fact, far from knocking down racial barriers, religion generally serves to maintain these historical divides and helps to develop new ones." So it's not a very rosy start. This is basically like the thesis of the book, very early in the introduction. And so right from the get-go, they tell you, like, if you were hoping that Christians would have the answer to racial division, it seems, at least from the data that they collected, that actually Christianity kind of seems to get in the way. And so what's the deal with that? How is this? This is not an encouraging place to begin, and yet it's a real place to begin in terms of the research that they did. If you dig a little bit further in the book, one of the things that they do in the book that really serves as an obstacle to understanding racial issues, and especially racial prejudice at a structural or systemic level, is they really talk about how much white evangelical Christians in particular really value individualism. And this is something not exclusive to white evangelicals. If any of you are familiar with cross-cultural research, I teach a class on cross-cultural ministry every year, and one of the bodies of research we look at shows that far and away of the unique characteristics that North Americans face, in the US, one of our most highly prized cultural values is individualism. And what we mean by that is we don't only see ourselves as individuals and identify as individuals, but we hold ourselves responsible for our station in life as individuals. And so this is something that, by and large, many Americans hold to, the idea that where you are in life, what you have in life, what you've achieved in life, or what you haven't achieved, are predominantly due to your individual merit, your individual talent, your individual ability. And if you want to change your circumstances, or change whatever you want to change in life, it is really primarily your individual responsibility to do so. And I put that out there just to say that this is something that is a very uniquely, deeply entrenched American value. There's nothing wrong with individualism per se, but it is something that if you look at other nations, the US rises far and above. We're number one as far as identifying with the values of cultural individualism. And what the authors of Divided by Faith say is that this actually provides a significant obstacle to understanding how racism might go beyond personal prejudice. So last quote from the book, and then I'll give you an example. It says, at the end, white evangelicals do not want a race problem. They want to see people get along and want people to have equal opportunity. In short, they yearn for colorblind people. This is the contemporary white American evangelical perspective. Even if you don't identify with white evangelicals or identify yourself in that way, a lot of the book really picks up on this issue of colorblindness and how typically a lot of people, when asked about racial division or racial issues in the US, kind of default to this mode of saying, I think things matter, but I wish that they didn't. I wish we could all kind of move beyond race and stop talking about it so that we could just see each other as individuals, right? That we could just see each other as people and just kind of stop bringing up these old historic divides and tensions and so forth. In fact, there's a lot of conversations, interviews in the book where they talk about how it's because we keep talking about it. That's actually that's causing the problem. So we need to move on from that so that we can all be individuals, equals on the same footing. I want to suggest to you briefly, if I can get to the next slide on colorblindness, I want to suggest to you that colorblindness, while coming from a place of good intentions, is actually not a very tenable perspective to hold when we talk about race for numerous reasons. These are just three, and we'll unpack each of these a little bit later tonight. One is that pretending not to see color does not actually change our implicit biases. This book, yet another book here, I don't know if you can see it's a little blind spot. This is, has anyone heard of this book or read it? It's an interesting compilation of data put together. It's based on, there was a group of Harvard sociologists who put together this assessment called the IAT, the Implicit Association Test. And one of the areas that they looked at was race. And essentially, if you look at this brief quote from the bottom, the book is a perspective, is a compilation of all the different ways that good people, like you and I, carry with us a boatload of hidden biases that are deep down and that don't really surface unless we're tested on them in the right conditions. And this idea I know my own mind, I'm able to assess others in a fair and accurate way, is actually what the book totally undermines, because they say that we carry a life, we have the hidden biases we all carry from a lifetime of exposure to cultural attitudes about age, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, social class, sexuality, disability, status, and nationality. And so this was an interesting book only because, again, it points to this conflict or hypocrisy or tension in the human condition where we'd like to think that we know ourselves and that we can even judge others fairly. And I think all of us would probably check the box of saying, like, I treat people equally, I see other people for who they are, I don't have implicit kind of racial hatred or bias toward others and so forth. And yet what the research shows again and again is that we all carry these biases whether or not we're aware of it or not. And so that's one reason why colorblindness, while coming from a good place of good intentions, actually doesn't work. Secondly, colorblindness promotes a kind of naive individualism. We talked about individualism already. It doesn't really give us the tools to talk about social inequity in society. Even if we all agreed that we could all be colorblind and see all people as equal, it doesn't account then for the fact that we live in a very racially divided society, divided by race, divided by class, social inequalities, social and economic inequalities that almost always fall along racial categories. And so what do we do with that? It doesn't, if we just keep going along with the idea of colorblindness, it doesn't really solve any of the realities that we're facing in society, where we look at communities like Ferguson and say, how could this be happening if we all see each other as equal? The last one, and I think this is an important one as well, I often hear people say things like, well, David, I don't see you as Chinese. I just see you as a person. And I know, again, I recognize where that comes from. I think it comes from a good place of saying, like, I'm trying not to judge you based on your appearance and the racial category that you fit into based on your appearance. But the challenge there is that when people say to me, like, I don't see you as a racial person, I don't see you as an ethnic person, I don't see you as Chinese, the main problem there is I see myself that way, right? When sometimes people say, if I don't see you as Chinese or I don't see you as Asian American, I want to say, well, I do, and I want you to see that part of me. I want you to know that that's a formative part of my identity. And when we claim to not see color, or when we claim that those cultural, ethnic, racial differences don't matter, we actually diminish formative aspects of our cultural identities. So there's lots of things here, but I want to keep going because of time and talk about maybe a bigger idea, and it's this idea of structural racism or structural sin. And so next slide, we'll keep going here, if you'll stick with me. This is a bit of a stretch, but I thought I would include this quote. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but how many of you have heard of Reinhold Niebuhr? It's kind of you seminarians and a few others, theologians and readers. One of the greatest theologians and ethicists of the 20th century, widely regarded as a really important voice in ethics and theology. And one of his most popular books, one of his most well-known books, was written in 1932. It was called Moral Man and Immoral Society. And it's funny, my dean always tells me that years after this book became well-known, Reinhold Niebuhr was being interviewed, and he was asked, 10 years later, 15 years later, now that your book has been upheld as a classic, what would you write differently about the book? And he basically said, well, I would just rename it Moral Man and Even More Immoral Society. And he says, basically the premise of the book in a nutshell is that there's a conflict and there's a tension between individuals and collective society. And he says what we have as individuals, he says, in smaller groups, as individual people, we have the capacity and the desire to be moral, to treat each other justly, to see each other for who we are, and to do right by one another. He says the problem always enters in is when we try to scale that, and we end up in society as a collective and in groups, and suddenly the whole thing just seems to come apart. And even though we desire to be moral as people, as a society, we always fail. And what happens as a group, he says, is oftentimes power comes into play, and this is basic political theory here. Once power enters into the situation, and you have a group that's trying to negotiate morality and ethics, suddenly all of those romanticized individual desires we had for one another to treat each other rightly kind of go out the window, and suddenly we're grasping and struggling for power. I'm going to read partway down in this quote. He says, he describes this tragedy of the human spirit. He says it's inability to conform its collective life to its individual ideals. As individuals, men and women believe that they ought to love and serve each other and establish justice between each other. However, and there's a big, transition here, he says, as racial, economic, and national groups, they take for themselves whatever their power can command. I use this as an example to talk about one of the challenges in talking about race, and I think we struggle in thinking structurally and systemically beyond our personal responsibilities in this conversation. Oftentimes, I find myself saying, well, I don't harbor any of these personal prejudices, and so why is this my responsibility to talk about this? An example that I use sometimes with my students in talking about this, trying to elaborate this, this idea of individuals and collectives, is this soup metaphor. And so this is a picture of a soup kitchen. And I talk about how if you and I were to get together for soup, let's say we weren't getting together for soup, but let's say we were just meeting to have a conversation, and you were running late, you forgot your lunch, I have a bowl of soup, and I want to share that soup with you. One-to-one, in a casual setting, I'm sure we could find a way for us to share the soup, right? We'll get another bowl, we'll get another spoon. Hopefully you like what I brought. If you're really hungry, we'll make the best of it. And it's no big deal, right? We'll divide it up. Hopefully you have enough, hopefully I have enough, and we'll call it a day, right? But let's say that you brought your friend along, and you both were in a hurry, and you both didn't have time for lunch, and you both were starving, and you both wanted to share my soup. Well, with 3 people, again, we could probably find a way. We just need another bowl, another spoon, and we can try to make it happen. If you brought your whole house with you, or your whole family, or what have you, it starts to get a little bit more complicated. We have to figure out, well, how much soup do we actually have? And how do we make sure that it's divided out evenly? And what if one of you has a gluten intolerance, or something along those lines? There's a lot more complexity to sharing the soup and to making it a fair kind of arrangement. And if you can imagine, once you get toward any reasonable size, even if you just had 10 people, suddenly I need not just to sit down over the table to share my soup with some friends. I need a whole soup distribution system that establishes fairness, how do we know what time we're going to do the soup distribution? What if you can't get off work in time and you can't make it to the soup time? Does that mean that you don't get any soup? What happens if someone has a big appetite or has a greater need and someone else has already eaten before they came? Who's going to be the one to tell them that they don't get any soup because they've already eaten? The questions and hypothetical situations you see go on and on. But this is this is what Niebuhr is illustrating, is the challenge of saying, how do we take what we know to be right, which is, I want to share my soup with you, and that shouldn't be a big problem. How do we scale that in a way that actually leads to equity and justice? And what he's pointing out is, he says, as we look at how these things play out in society, what happens inevitably as a group is there becomes a gap or a disconnect. He calls it hypocrisy. Another thing we could call it is just this just kind of conflict of interest between our individual desires and our collective wants. I have a short video that kind of points to this, and let me preview the video really quick. It's a 3-minute clip from a documentary called An American Dilemma. Actually, the title is called American Denial, and it's about a report called American Dilemma that was written by a Swedish researcher and sociologist who was commissioned by the Carnegie Corporation in the 1930s or 40s to come to the US and to study our race problem. And what he found was, you'll see kind of a little bit of a preview in the clip. He basically says exactly what Niebuhr is saying here. He says, Americans seem very confused. He says, individually and even collectively, they seem to uplift these values like their civil religion, equality, right, inclusion, fairness, rightness, and justice. And then he says, but there seems to be a bit of a problem because the reality of on the ground of how people are living, there seems to be a clear racial hierarchy and clear social difference. And so what he says, what he ends up concluding, he calls, the film is called American Denial, in part because he says that basically just to survive, Americans live in a state of hypocrisy and denial, where we say one thing about what we believe, but then we practice as a society something else entirely. So if we can get the clip, and hopefully we'll...
When we say we should live an examined life, what are we meaning? We're not saying an examined life is a happy life. We're just saying that we prefer an examined life, even if it makes us unhappy, because at least we're learning the truth about who we are.
my general impression of human beings is that they are very confused in their mind. Their public opinions are certainly not their private opinions.
In the 1930s, a Swedish investigator, Gunnar Myrdal, was asked to conduct a 5-year examination of American life and values, trying to untangle America's longing for equality from its habits of racial domination.
The nose, the lips, the hair, the skin color still identifies people as somehow less than those who are obviously descended from the free. That doesn't go away when you end legal slavery.
We, as a nation, have been eager to put our ugly racial past behind us and to imagine that, all of that is history and everything is good now. We can exhale.
In 1944, Myrdal published an unsettling study of American society. He called it An American Dilemma. It was an exhaustive examination of the historical and psychological meaning of race in the life of the nation. The questions it raised still trouble us today. Could racism and egalitarianism be two sides of the same coin? Does racial oppression require cooperation across the color line? What if our faith in the American creed depends on the habit of denial?
If you take the idea of equality of opportunity, if you take the idea of fairness and justice, and you put those up against a reality, you have a conflict. Can you be in denial about these kinds of things indefinitely? Or at some point, do the stories you tell about yourself have to confront reality?
The dilemma that Myrdal described was essentially what I just described earlier, this idea that Americans certainly uphold this value of racial equality. Certainly after the Civil Rights era, we say this is an open and free nation where we really prize the ability that everyone has an opportunity to better themselves and to change the circumstances around them. And yet what Myrdal picks up on is the dilemma is that even though we say we believe even though we hold this belief very close to our hearts, the social reality of it is far behind it and is much slower. Actually, as a little bit of a footnote, Myrdal's study was one of the key pieces of argumentation in the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, where they went to Myrdal's report to talk about some of the structural inequalities. But I want to suggest to you that this is the reason this individualism and collectivism, or the gap between our individual ideals and our collective reality, that this is kind of one of the major obstacles or roadblocks when we talk about race, right? We have one side saying, and this is where the Divided by Faith research says Christians tend to fall on the side of individualism, where we say, I don't see what the problem is, because as individuals, we all agree that, we're all good people and none of us are racist, right? And then on the other side, we say, but then there's all these social and structural inequalities, and there's these issues, and what happens, just like in the media, everything is polarized, and we're pulled apart, and it's suggested to us that it's one or the other, right? That this is really just an individual issue, and that's really the root of it, or we say, no, it's really all structural, it's all systemic, and that's really the issue. And I think one of the challenges we have as Christians is to be reconcilers, to be peacemakers in the middle, to say, how do both individual realities and collective realities come into play? When we talk about structural racism, I want to give you one kind of brief definition and then pause for a little bit of what we'll try to have you turn to your neighbor and discuss for examples. But Racism is, very briefly, this is classic David T. Wellman, a system of advantage based on race, or more concisely, prejudice plus power. This is the idea that racism is not only about personal bias, right? But it has a systemic or structural kind of reality attached to it. And here we could talk about individual racial bias or prejudice being a universal human characteristic, and yet it's distinct from the cumulative effects of societal norms. And so I want to give you a chance to maybe process this a bit. I know for some of you, this is kind of 101. You've had this conversation before, and yet for others of you, perhaps not. I want to give you a chance to take we'll try to do this in like 5 minutes, which isn't a lot of time. But I want to encourage you to turn to a neighbor or the people you came with, and what I want you to discuss, if you can within this 5-minute period, is what is the difference, do you think, between personal prejudice and structural racism? Like, can you think of some examples, either in contemporary society, in your own life, and things that you've experienced? Like, what's the difference between them, and what's the significance of that difference? Or if you want to go to the second question instead, what are some ways in which systemic racialization has impacted the church? Right? And so maybe if you have some examples already, you can move on to that second question. But I'd love for you to take 5 minutes and turn to a neighbor. And as we've kind of digested a lot of this stuff, or maybe are still digesting, process with one another. Take 5 minutes, turn around, and then we'll regroup. And I'll, if you're feeling really brave, I'll ask a couple of people to maybe share a bit of some examples. You won't have to, but take 5 minutes really quick, turn to a neighbor, and discuss these. All right, I hate to cut your time short, but I wonder if there are any brave souls who want to contribute a thought, an opinion, a question. We'll have time for more interaction as well, but I think there's mics available. Any examples? I was just talking with Stu, like I'm always looking for good examples of kind of how personal prejudice scales and becomes something structural, or where there's power in the equation. Anyone have a good idea, good example, good question? Suddenly quiet. It's just like class. Anybody? Yeah, we got one here.
I don't have an answer, but I think one of the conundrums is that the people who have the power can be unconscious about the system,
Right.
because they get everything they need from the way it is,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore it's an assumption to be normal.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yeah.
And to drop that is very difficult. I was just explaining our few minutes that I've had the privilege of living in other cultures long enough and learn their languages, etc., that I experienced being white and American, and I felt I was being prejudiced upon. And I could feel the resentment, I could feel the difficulties in my life because of it.
Yeah.
And then I also got the lesson, I'm an airplane ride back to a system where this all goes away.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, power, like Niebuhr says, power is really kind of the base conversation there. We really struggle with power, and in particular, those of us who have power never like to be told that it's something we possess, right? We like to think that, well, I'm not powerful. What power do I have? I joke with my students a lot. If we were all just individuals, I'd love to invite my students into my office hours and just say, like, hey, let's just talk. Let's just hash it out. We're just, we're just two people. I don't have any power over you. I'm just your professor. I give you a grade at the end of the term. But let's just put that aside. I can pretend all I want that I don't have power as a professor, and I can say, no, really, tell me what you think. But inevitably, my students get that there is a power dynamic at play, and that I hold the keys to their grade point average. And for some of them, that's a lot of power. For others, they could care less. But still, it's kind of silly for me to try to say, well, I'm going to set that aside. Like, I don't have professor privilege. I'm just a person. Right? But in reality, those power dynamics are very tricky. And again, no, it's always uncomfortable to be told that you have power in a situation. Oftentimes, when it seems invisible to us, or we feel like we don't have it. So, power is a huge piece of this. In fact, that's how Wellman defines it concisely, right? It's prejudice plus power. But any other, maybe one more example? Thank you so much. In the back here.
Hello. I was going to say an example of the difference between personal prejudice and structural racism is that, let's say, as a Chinese American, I have prejudice against white people. And I can say, I don't like white people, and people can say, oh, you're racist. But let's say America goes to war with China. Who might get put in an internment camp, or who might get discriminated against? It's me, because I don't have the same power that other people might hold. And so that's the difference to me between personal prejudice and structural racism.
Yeah, definitely. It's a powerful example. There's always a group that has some kind of dominant, entrenched interest. And if we think of ourselves only as individuals, then the power conversation kind of goes away, and we think, well, what's the big deal? And yet, in reality, it's often hard to see power when you're part of the dominant group. But when you're outside of the dominant group, whatever that dominant group is, whether it's based on race, class, gender, ability, sexuality, or something else, we don't like to think of it that way. But when we see it from a different perspective, actually, even as this other gentleman was sharing, when you come outside of your culture in a different context, suddenly you realize, oh, like there is something structural. There is some kind of power dynamic at work here, and it either works in my favor or works against me. I'm mindful of time, and I appreciate your contribution. We're going to have time to talk one more time before we wrap up, but I'm going to keep going because I realize that we're kind of at that halfway point, but I've used up way more than half of my time. So a couple examples. Next slide. We'll move quickly through some of this. Some examples of what we might call structural racism or systemic racism. I would say there's at least two major buckets. Well, probably three if you wanted to be comprehensive. I've only got a couple located up here. Education, housing, criminal justice. Those are probably like three huge categories. Each one has subcategories where we would say there are structural racial issues at work in all three of these. These are just a couple from recent headlines. A story from The Atlantic about the persistence of U.S. racial segregation. A great piece on This American Life called House Rules about where we live and how geography determines a lot of our other factors around quality of life. Just based on our zip code, researchers can pull up your zip code and make all sorts of actuarial assumptions about you, and oftentimes they're correct. School resegregation, this is, again, a persistent issue, especially as we look at, we're now 60 years past Brown versus Board of Education. What kind of progress have we made? Not very much, and so that's kind of a problem. So all of these things are structural issues where in each case, we would say there's no evil mastermind of education or housing or criminal justice behind the curtain who is like the racist dictator who says I have a new plan and I'm going to keep people down through my secret, policy machine. That's not really happening. If that was the case, we could just find that person and, I don't know, put them, remove them from power and then let the system do its work. And yet, oftentimes these structural forces seem to just it's almost like an invisible hand, if you will. Like there's these forces at work that seem to benefit dominant groups. And then we look at the situation and say, gosh, housing segregation, educational segregation, there's these stark inequalities. How did it happen when none of us are racist? And I think that's where structural racism comes in, because the collective actions of the society as a whole has moved against our individual interests. And that's what, again, that's what Niebuhr was talking about. Next slide, real quickly. Structural issues, and as we transition of thinking about Ferguson and Seattle, I don't know how you thought about the events of Ferguson or what the headlines or stories or realities meant to you. I have a couple of images on one side here. These are from Palestine. I just thought it was interesting. One of my colleagues traveled extensively during this period and was talking about how Ferguson not just struck a chord and erupted in movements around the US, but literally around the world in places as far-reaching as Palestine. What would people in Palestine have to gain? Why would they identify with what was happening in Ferguson? Why would they identify with Eric Garner, right? A black man in New York who was killed on the sidewalk, who they never met, right? I think these are signals that there was something important about what was happening in Ferguson, that there was some kind of pattern, there was something observable that we could look at that could say, there seems to be something in communities, in neighborhoods across the country, and in literally communities around the world. There were people rising up together to say, we identify with the situation, we understand that something is wrong, and we want our voices to be heard, and we want to see justice served in this process. When we talk about structural racism in criminal justice, I think the Department of Justice report on Ferguson, this is one small statistic from it that just says, maybe the reality on the ground in Ferguson was not just an incident that became overblown, but perhaps it was years and years in the making of policies and structures and individuals, not just the bad apples who carried racial prejudice, but perhaps there were a lot of kind of structural forces at play that led to particular disparate outcomes for those on the ground. Next slide. As we try to move from Ferguson to Seattle to say what do these have to do with one another, a really interesting article from The Atlantic called Self-Segregation, Why It's So Hard for Whites to Understand Ferguson. This is a brief quote from it. And I guess you could say this is the dilemma that faces us not just in Ferguson, but in Seattle as well, and really in the US, where we live relatively isolated from one another. The article says, the chief obstacle to having an intelligent conversation across the racial divide is that white Americans live in communities that face far fewer problems and talk mostly to other white people. The social networks of whites are a remarkable 91% white. In fact, over 75% of whites have entirely white social networks without any minority presence at all. If you're interested in digging a little bit into the research was compiled by a think tank called the Public Religion and Research Institute or something along those lines. And if you're wondering what social network means, it's not talking about your Facebook friends. It's actually, they're using the term more literally to talk about circles of connection. And the question they asked, they were actually asking a relational question. The question wasn't, do you know someone who's Mexican? or Chinese, or black, or Native American, or what have you. They ask people questions like, have you had a meaningful conversation with someone? Would you describe that person? And what are they like? And in the past 6 months, like how many times have you had a conversation around these topics? And what they found in digging through the research was that these were the results around homogeneity, right? That for the majority of whites, that there were their social networks, their relational networks were 91% white, and that 75% had no racial diversity at all in their social networks. And so one of the things that the article points out is that this research was actually done before Ferguson, and they did the same research after Ferguson, and it showed that the disparities, one of the things that they asked them were about kind of general questions of, does America have a race problem? What does this mean? After Ferguson, they asked essentially a similar question, which was, are blacks treated fairly? Are blacks treated unfairly? What does this mean for you? And what the data did after Ferguson was it skewed even further. It became even more polarized than it had before, which makes sense if you think about it, because people, if they live in entirely different social situations, then of course they're going to see something from entirely different angles. And what's, I guess, a little bit discouraging or sad about it is that given what had occurred, they were literally looking at the same event and seeing it from opposite perspectives, because this is what we would call relational epistemology, right? Which is the things that we believe to be true are socially reinforced by the people that we care deeply about. So our friends, our family, our churches, our pastors, these tend to be some of the determining factors in the things that we hold to be good and plausible and rational and true. And we don't always, again, we like to think of ourselves as individuals. Everything that I know to be true, I hold that to be true as a rational, autonomous, thinking individual. And yet the reality is that a lot of what we believe about the world and what we understand to be true and good and beautiful comes from the social networks that inform us. Okay, keep going. Next slide. Wow, time has gone away. That's okay. Seattle will have to, move through this quickly. Encourage you to ask questions about this if it goes too fast. A little bit of history in Seattle. Seattle, essentially, the summary here is Seattle was no different than any other city in terms of the major factors that led to its social segregation. Now, to be fair to Seattle, I love Seattle. Let me say, I've spent the majority of my almost my entire adult life in Seattle. My kids were born and raised here. I'm in Seattle public schools, so I love Seattle. But it's interesting to me that Seattle may not be a Detroit or Baltimore, Milwaukee or Cleveland, other more segregated cities. But Seattle is not necessarily this idyllic, this post-racial kind of wonderland that a lot of people like to think of it as. And so when you dig into the history of Seattle, you find that just like everywhere else in the country, we find things like racially restrictive housing covenants in the history of all of our properties. We find opposition to civil rights legislation. That's what was happening in '64. There was an open housing referendum to end racial discrimination, and it was soundly defeated by the populace, 2-1. It wasn't until '68 that fair housing went through at a federal level, and so City of Seattle went along with that. But even after '68, and keep in mind, this is not that long ago. I don't know if '68 seems like a long time ago to you or not, but a lot of us were alive in '68. And so this is not that long ago, but keep in mind that this is the time at which racially restrictive housing covenants are no longer legal, and yet they often remain on the books for decades later, not just, even though they're no longer legally valid, they remain as a part of the historical record. And so if we're wondering, why do people live where they live? Can I get to the next slide? Here are a few examples, actually the next one after that. These are some racially restrictive housing covenants, and you can look these up online. There are a ton of these for every neighborhood in Seattle. Seattle has over 50 to 60 neighborhoods, depending on how you count. There's no shortage of finding these. The University of Washington has tons of archives. I picked out just a few that I thought were interesting, mostly because of the way they described these. If you're not familiar with racially restrictive housing covenants, this is how they work. Here's one from Green Lake. It says, no person or persons of Asiatic, African, or Negro blood, lineage, or extraction shall be permitted to occupy a portion of said property or any building thereon except a domestic servant or servants who may actually and in good faith be employed by white occupants of such premises. That was Green Lake. Here's one from Ballard. No part of said property hereby conveyed shall ever be used or occupied. And what I think is interesting is the kind of very selective and random way that these racial groups are singled out. So in Ballard, apparently, cannot be occupied by any Hebrew or by any person of the Ethiopian, Malay, or Asiatic race. And again, some of these are racial terms of a different era as well. Bellevue, no surprise here, no person other than one of the white and Gentile, and sorry, was that too close to home? No, you just have to, I mean, that was not a personal dig at Bellevue. It was more of a reference to the historic racialization of suburban development. So let me in case I don't want to get an angry email for those of you from Bellevue, it's just a reference to the fact that the way the suburbs were zoned and developed and underwritten by the Federal Housing Administration, they were redlined, and that happened in the suburbs anyway. No person other than one of the white and Gentile and Caucasian race shall be permitted to occupy any property, and so forth. One of the things that I hope is clear from this and the randomness of these different restrictions is that we didn't get to talk about this. I hope that someone in a future week will mention this. Race is not even really a thing. Race is a social construction. It's totally arbitrary. Race is not a biological category. Race is socially constructed based on, as you can see in these very particular covenants, a particular group of people that we didn't want to live in these buildings or properties, right? These deeds are written into the title of the property, and they serve as, right, exclusionary codes to keep people living in certain parts of the city. There's a couple examples of this. Innis Arden is apparently still a gated community up in the shoreline area. This kind of offensive image is from the Coon Chicken Inn, which was a restaurant that had a number of different franchises around the area. What it basically shows, again, this is not to single out the evil people who wrote these restrictive covenants. These were pretty much just boilerplate exclusionary clauses in all the properties, in all commercial, residential, and other transferred properties and real estate all throughout the city of Seattle. And so if you wonder, like, well, why does the racial makeup of Seattle look the way it is? Why is it so divided north and south? It's a very simple explanation. It's that these were legally enforced, that if you were a person of color, or if you were of any of these racial groups, if you were African, Negro, Asiatic, Malay, Hebrew, and so forth, if you were not white, then you couldn't live in these places, you couldn't rent these places, you couldn't shop in these places. In some occurrences, you could be a domestic servant, but you certainly couldn't reside there. And so what we have to think about is, even though these laws are no longer on the books, what happens if we go to the next slide, get to the next slide, and I think I've used this map before. If you look at this, it's kind of a little bit hard to see, but this is the 2010 census. If you wonder, like, why people live where they live, it's because this is where they've been living for nearly a century. And what happens when we study, especially in urban areas, when we study ethnic enclaves, what's interesting is this high persistence rate of ethnic isolation. But this basically just means if you're a person of color and you live in a particular community, there's a high degree of chance that the majority demographic of that population is going to stay the same from decade to decade. And so there are examples of change. We've seen a lot of change, for example, in the Central District over the past 20 years, and it's been very dramatic. And yet, at the same time, one of the structural forces that we have to work against is the structure of geography, the logic of real estate and capitalism. And so I guess a question, food for thought, something you can chew on a bit, is why does the social logic of homogeneity, of wanting to be with others who are like us, why does this seem to have such power over us? One of the ways that this has been enforced in Seattle and other places is through real estate practices like redlining, like blockbusting, racial steering. Racial steering is something that actually still occurs to this day. My wife is a realtor, so we talk about this sometimes. Research as recent as 2008 shows that basically if you are wanting to buy a home and enlist the services of a realtor or a real estate agent, they will most likely, oftentimes implicitly, steer you into a place that matches your racial demographic. And they've done these pilot studies where they even plant people with really high credit scores, really good financial resources, and they put them and they make them say African American, and they say that we want to buy a home in this neighborhood. And they research and they show how realtors gently kind of say, well, maybe you would like it over here. And it's not so much an intentional move to perpetuate these patterns, but it's part of these implicit associations that we carry with us. Oh gosh, we are out of time. I'm going to go right to the end. And so if we could skip over and just get to the 2 Corinthians passage. We'll end with this, because I know that we've covered a lot of random material, and we're going to try to piece it together in the time of interaction we have for questions and so forth. But I want to end with this, not just because it's a nice way to tie it up with a Bible verse and send you on home feeling good, but really because I believe that the Christian story forces us to think about issues of race in a different way. And one of the things we'll wrestle with in our time of conversation after and hopefully in the weeks to come as well is how is it that Christian formation can shape us, can mold us, can form us into communities and can shape our identities in ways that counteract the ways that racial formation or this social logic of homogeneity has shaped us in other ways. So it seems to me that it's not a question of whether or not we're going to be formed by these social structural realities. We're already breathing in these ideas all the time. The question just seems to be, is our Christian discipleship going to form us in new patterns of thinking, in different ways of understanding the logic of real estate? Or is it actually going to be captive to kind of the default status quo, which is I'm most comfortable with people who are like me, and I'm going to be funneled into these pockets socially and economically into sameness. And this is where the ministry of reconciliation comes into play, and it's encouraging to me. This is the Easter season. Hopefully all of you are aware that Easter's not a day, but it is a season that the church celebrates. And what happens in the resurrection is this thing that Paul calls the new creation. And when I was growing up in church, this phrase was always used to me like this idea that if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old has gone, the new is here. This was always used basically as, and I loved growing up in youth group, but it was basically, I remember just associating this with my old immoral habits going away, right? That basically what this meant was that if I was going to be in Christ, then I had to take all my explicit music that I was listening to and like put those in a drawer or give them away. The old, was gone, and the new had come, where I had to listen to Christian music and do other things like that. That is not, I think we could talk about moral sanctification. That's certainly one aspect of what Paul is talking about here. But this language of new creation is actually much, much bigger than that. And what Paul is saying actually is that God is remaking the world and is actually restoring the whole cosmos. And he's doing that in and through a particular community of people. And it begins with individuals, but it doesn't end there. It actually, when he invites us into the ministry of reconciliation, says, because anyone who's in Christ is a new creation, he's talking about new creation life that begins with the presence of the Holy Spirit in an individual, but spills over into society and actually becomes the key and the vehicle, the means by which God is restoring and remaking and reconciling the whole created order, which to me is really exciting and gives me hope. It's just a reminder, and we'll wrap up with this because I'm over on time, but it's a reminder to me that what it means to be Christian is not just to be reconciled to God and therefore reconciled to others, but it means that I'm participating in the recreating work that God wants to do all around us. And I really believe that if we live more fully into the Christian story, if we reimagine what it means to be community together, we might actually begin to see the fruit of this reconciliation among us. But it's going to really take a lot of creativity, a lot of imagination. It'll really take a lot of hard conversations to have with one another as we look at these big structural forces that are so powerful around us. So my encouragement, I guess, to you is not just to be reconciled to God and to find your life inside of Christ, but to say, how can we think about living into the story of Christian discipleship in a way that somehow disrupts or causes conflict with the patterns of geography and race and structure and education that are so around us. And so how can we do that as a community? I don't have the answers, but it's something that we can process, hopefully, in the weeks to come. And I would really encourage you in the time of question and answer that we'll have now to help me process some of this as we think about what it means to be the church together. So thanks so much.
you have a question, just raise your hand. Check. Okay.
Appreciate your wisdom and your whole thing, man. So I kind of, in my head, I had a hard time not flipping one of your questions that you posed to us earlier about what is the impact of like racialization on the church. But in my head, I kept flipping that question. It's like, what's the impact of a racist church on the structural systems of our, our society? Mm-hmm. And my question is, what do you think about, like, how in touch do you think our churches are, like in this, in Seattle, with the work that needs to be done to embrace, a life of reconciliation?
You want a number scale? How in touch? No, it's a great question. Not very and I think it's not a particular issue that's unique to Seattle. I think we didn't have time. We skipped over this quote that actually I used last time. It's from Willie Jennings. Willie Jennings, the theologian at Duke, says basically he calls the Christian faith that a lot of us practice, he calls it racial faith. And he basically just says that it's a kind of version of Christian faith, but it's operating under the auspices, under the structures of racialization. And he says racial faith just seems so much more authoritative and decisive than Christian faith, than genuinely Christian faith. And so I think one of the things we have to wrestle with is saying, like, in what ways have we not just avoided, talking about race, but how have we actually been domesticated within its logic for so long that all that we live and practice and believe about our Christianity gets kind of tainted. It gets a little bit twisted, right? Where we justify our homogeneity, or we read anachronistically into the Christian story, we read it differently. And so I think there's a lot of deep structural issues at the bottom. But I would say that I think your original question was just how in touch are we with the conversation. I want to say that on the one hand, not very, and yet at the same time, I think there's good things happening. I think there's people who are making good effort. This is happening, which is fantastic. I think that it's hard to do an assessment of the city as a whole. I feel like there's different fronts emerging, there's different organizations at work, there's different people and individuals, pastors, ministries, like yours even, where I think people are trying to have these conversations more holistically, more intentionally. And that's really hopeful to me. So it's so hard to quantify. I don't know if, probably depends a lot on your perspective too. And I think one of the real challenges that we faced at Quest in the years and years of having these conversations is some people are just entering into the conversation for the first time. And that should be applauded. Like we should celebrate whenever anyone moves in the right direction, even if it's a baby step. But then some of us have been having the conversation for 10 years, 15 years or more, and we shouldn't be having the same conversation we've been having. I think we should, 10 years later, we should be saying we should still be welcoming some people in, but it shouldn't just be this revolving door of and we go back. And that was one of the conflicts I think we had at Quest, was not so much conflicts, but challenges, was to say, how do we keep inviting others into the discourse and yet also kind of move and make progress so that we're not just explaining ourselves over and over again to different people? And I think that's a real challenge. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but let's keep talking.
Hey, April, can you get
So one thing I find very informative to me, the connection that you made between individualism and racism. How this big culture of being individuals, emphasizing on individual values and treating people as individual rather seeing them from whole, help produce the fact that people don't see race sometimes, don't see color. So I'm hoping you can expand a little more on that, on how individualism kind of blind people so that they cannot see race, or they're colorblind and they don't think there's racism anymore in this country? Or can you give some more examples on that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think we had to move quickly, and that's probably one of the main things I hope that some of you were able to put together, is that our bias, our cultural bias toward individualism, actually blinds us, creates obstacles to seeing racism as a structural phenomenon. Examples of this, to go back to maybe if we talked about schools, we could say, well, in a particular classroom, in a public school classroom, it's very likely that the teacher does not hold any personal prejudice toward certain groups in the classroom that are present. And yet, when we look at something like the achievement gap in public schools, when we look at the very statistically significant difference between test scores, standardized test scores between, say, whites and blacks. Like, there has to be some accounting for that. And if we only think that the reason that there's differences in those scores are because of individual racists, then we're going to be looking a long time to find, the people who are responsible for the gap in those test scores. This is not a very good example, but I would say that when we talk about public education, that's one of the clearest examples to me that we have a structural problem, not a problem of personally prejudiced, racially biased teachers, administrators, at least not explicitly. Everyone harbors that implicit bias. Trying to think of some other examples. I don't know. I mean, whether we're talking about housing or criminal justice, I think in each case, we're talking about how essentially, if the common denominator in our hermeneutic, if you will, is that we see individuals as individual actors and not complex actors in a system, then I think we're always going to want to simplify the root of the conflict, if that makes any sense. And in each of those cases and in each of those scenarios, there's different ways to weight individual and systemic causes, but there's no way to quantify it, and I think that's why it gets really muddy and difficult to explain, is that individual responsibility always matters, but it's not the only factor, and that's the way that we're culturally biased. Other thoughts? Got a few over here.
Maybe we can.
Hi, I have a question. So my question is about, I really like that you mentioned how we have to start the conversation, and like we're doing that here tonight. So it's a two-part question. The first question is, especially with people who are different from us and have different backgrounds from us, I found it harder to even begin the conversation. So what are some good ways to do that? And then secondly, are there any examples, or have you seen good ways people have gone beyond the conversation to start talking about race and then do something about it?
Yeah, great questions. How do we begin the conversation? I think it's awkward, but some intentional structure helps. And I think sharing stories is always, people hopefully are able to talk about themselves in ways that are honest and disarming. I think that sometimes just getting our own particular narrative out on the table is something that really, especially if your experience has been different from someone else, really helps to open the conversation in new ways. And the thing about sharing those personal stories is we begin to see differences not only along the lines of race, but also we see generational differences of class and gender as well that come out. And I think as we share those stories, hopefully one of the goals could be just to listen intently to one another and to say how have our experiences differed, and how has that shaped the outcomes in our lives, the way that we understand the things that we're seeing around us and so forth. And there's a lot of exercises that people, there's a whole, I could point you to some resources later that are basically small group exercises where people are asked particular questions about their backgrounds, and exercises around privilege and awareness. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can just kind of get the ball rolling. But I think in that process, it is awkward, and I think that's inevitable. I think it takes a lot of courage and intentionality. in terms of people who are maybe taking that next step, examples of that. This is always tough. I think if you were to look at kind of an awareness, advocacy, action kind of spectrum, it seems to me that a lot of us like to hang out in the awareness group, and we have a very short attention. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I have a short attention span. So I like to be educated on a lot of issues, and then I feel good because I'm like, and now I'm aware of that. I'm going to take that awareness and take a nap. I think it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to say okay, now that I'm aware of this, and especially true in the information age, what do we do with our awareness? And this is where I think that I wish people would dial back their awareness and kind of step up their advocacy and action and say I'm going to choose something. I can't be an advocate for all issues of poverty and racism and human trafficking and gender disparities and wealth inequality. I can't do it all. But I think this is where we have to do some reflection, hopefully in community and among ourselves, to say where am I located in life, and in what ways might I be able to commit to some sustained focused attention on this particular issue. Who's around me who feels similarly? What kind of convictions? How am I prayerfully discerning with others? This seems to be a common conviction that we're working on, and I think the communal piece is really important, because I think left to our own devices, we just often spin our wheels. I'm going to defeat human trafficking because I saw this documentary and it really moved me, and tomorrow I'm going to hit the pavement and I'm going to start, recruiting people to this organization. That's not a bad thing per se, but I think we're a lot more effective when we can discern those things together and say, let's stay focused, let's sustain our attention, and let's really intentionally move toward this one particular thing. And that's where I think the conversation can actually be more transformative over the longer term. And so I think that's where you hopefully can bring in other organizations, other perspectives, people who are more seasoned in that field, and say, so I don't know, that's very generic, but my suggestion would be pick one thing. Pick one thing and try to, I tell people it's, oftentimes with my students who are very idealistic, I tell them it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And so you really have to prepare for a much longer journey.
Let's give David a big hand. I know a lot of you guys have a bunch of questions. I have a lot of questions, but I also want to get you out of here so we don't start this thing where we keep ending later and later. But I'm going to use Joyce's question as a segue to our announcements. As part of the series, we're going to be having Brenda Salter McNeil from Seattle Pacific University come here on April 25th, and she's going to do exactly that. She's going to lead us in a morning workshop, which will be a safe environment where you can talk directly about race and racism as it relates to you. And we want to encourage you guys to kind of begin this process of racial reconciliation on a personal level. If you haven't heard of Brenda Salter McNeil, she's amazing. She's in my top 3 list of speakers on race in America, along with Dave, of course. But it's an honor that she would come here and share with us. And so I really want to encourage you to do this if you can. As Dave kind of mentioned, and for me personally, my transformation and my journey, understanding my privilege and understanding race and how other people experience it has really come through interactions and conversations with people. And so in this workshop, I'm not exactly sure what Brenda has planned, but I do know it will be a safe venue to do that. It's a Saturday morning, but it's only 3 hours. Okay, you can do it. If you want to sign up for that, it's going to be April 25th from 9 to noon. We have a computer in the back that you can sign up on. We also have cards that you can sign up on, or you can go to upc.org/Ferguson workshop. Next week is going to be interesting. This week was interesting, of course. Next week, we're going to continue our discussion on systemic racism in Seattle. We have a man named Bob Chang from Seattle U coming to talk about criminal justice in our state. Bob chaired a committee that wrote a critique of the King County justice system, or criminal justice system, as it pertains to race. So he will come and present his findings and his report, and then we'll have a response from Mark Larson, who's deputy chief of the King County prosecuting attorney, as well as Jeff Gohagen, who's in the SPD SWAT team. And we will open that up to you and your questions as well. I expect that to be really interesting. So come back next week, bring your friends, same time, same place. There's other things going on in our city as well. Taproot Theater has a show called Best of Enemies that's going right now, and it's wonderful. It's about segregation in North Carolina. You can find tickets at taproottheater.org. And even at this church, we have another event coming up on April 18th, which is put on by our Balkan Task Force. And what this is, it's a fundraiser, it's a movie night, and we will be showing a movie about the story of two NBA players, one from Serbia and one from Croatia, whose relationship was affected by the war in Yugoslavia. It's a true story, it's compelling. You should come to that as well. So we're already late. Next week we'll try to end on time. But let me close real quick in a word of prayer, and then you guys can continue to ask questions, and we'll have some treats in the back. Father God, thank you so much for the honor it is to have this conversation. Thank you for David and the gift of teaching that you've given him. God, I pray that as a community we can wrestle with these things that challenge us, Lord. God, help us to see places where we have not identified with the collective sins that we participate in. God, would you convict us in the ways that we need to grow and we need to change? God, help us to grow relationships across ethnic barriers. And God, I pray that this church would be a place of reconciliation where people from across the world can reflect your diversity and your creativity, and be a sort of beacon, God, of reconciliation in this city. Thank you for tonight, Lord. Keep us safe as we go home. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Cool.